All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're taking a look at something that's really at the heart of regulated industries, especially when it comes to pharmaceuticals and medical devices. We're talking about how companies deal with customer complaints and, what happens when things go wrong and a product needs to be recalled,
Mhm.
because at the end of the day, it's all about patient safety, right?
Exactly. And, it's really a much more complex process than people might realize.
Oh, absolutely.
We've got a whole mountain of information here to dig into, everything from, those specific regulations like 21 CFR, parts 110, 111, 202, the whole gamut, 211, 212, 310,
Wow.
all of which, cover everything from how things are manufactured to how they're labeled. And then we've also got, practical stuff like GMP and GLP training materials, even international guidelines from the ICH, the big players. And we're going to look at real-world examples, too, and see how different organizations are actually putting all this into practice.
It's like a whole ecosystem of guidelines and
It
regulations.
really is.
So what we're going to try to do today is really unpack all of that and understand why having really solid systems for managing these complaints and then, if necessary, going through that whole recall process, it's not just about checking boxes for the regulators. It's really about building and maintaining trust. And most importantly, it's about patient safety.
Couldn't agree more.
So we're going to explore how these processes actually work as it's like a feedback loop. They help companies identify problems early on, ideally before they become huge issues, figure out what caused them, and then, take steps to correct things.
Right.
And of course, we'll be doing all this while keeping in mind the whole regulatory world that these companies operate in, where everything has to be completely transparent and documented down to the last detail.
Transparency is key.
Okay, so let's start with the beginning of the process. Complaint handling. So let's say a patient or maybe a doctor reaches out to a company and says, hey, there's something wrong with this medication. What makes a system for dealing with that feedback actually effective? Like, what are the hallmarks of a really good system?
Well, a truly effective system, it does more than just, write down the complaint and file it away somewhere.
Mm.
It really understands that each complaint, even if it seems small or isolated, it could be a sign of a much bigger problem.
Oh, interesting.
It's like one piece of a puzzle. On its own, it doesn't tell you much. But when you start getting more complaints and you start seeing a pattern, that's when you realize, oh, maybe there's an issue with the manufacturing process itself, or maybe there's something wrong with the raw materials we're using.
Right. So you're not just reacting to individual complaints, you're looking for those trends.
Exactly. You're looking for those recurring themes. And that's how companies can be proactive. They can spot potential problems before they become widespread, before they cause serious harm.
That makes a lot of sense. And this whole idea of being proactive, of having systems in place to prevent problems, it really ties into those current good manufacturing practices, right? The CGMPs.
Absolutely. Regulations like 21 CFR Part 211, they spell out very clearly that companies need to have written procedures, strict controls for every step of the manufacturing process.
Right.
So when a complaint comes in, it's basically saying, hey, there might be a gap somewhere in your system. Maybe one of your procedures isn't as strong as it should be, or maybe there's a control that's not working properly.
So the complaint handling system becomes a way to kind of check and balance those CGMP processes.
Exactly. It's a feedback mechanism to make sure everything is running smoothly and that product quality is consistent.
Okay, so let's get even more specific.
Yeah.
Let's imagine a scenario. Let's say a doctor calls a pharmaceutical company and says, hey, I've got a vial of this injectable medication, and there are visible particles floating in it.
Oh.
What happens next? What's the role of the quality control unit in that whole process?
So the quality control unit, or the QC unit, they are like the gatekeepers of quality for the entire company.
Okay.
And their job, as spelled out in regulations like, that same 21 CFR Part 211, is to make sure that every single component, every ingredient that comes into the facility, and every finished product that goes out meets strict quality standards.
So they're involved from the very beginning to the very end.
From start to finish, yeah. So when a complaint like that comes in, particles in an injectable, that's a huge red flag for the QC unit. It means their system, the gate, so to speak, might have been breached.
Makes sense.
So they're responsible for taking that complaint, assessing how serious it is, and then launching a full-blown investigation to figure out exactly what happened and how widespread the problem might be.
So when we talk about an investigation, we're not talking about, just a quick glance. We're talking about a really deep dive, right?
Oh, yeah. It's a thorough, meticulous process. It's like almost like a forensic investigation for pharmaceuticals.
Wow.
They'll go back and look at all the batch records for that particular lot of medication. Did anything go wrong during manufacturing? Did anyone deviate from the standard procedures?
Okay.
They'll also pull samples that were retained from that batch, which regulations like 21 CFR, Part 320, the one about keeping samples for bioavailability testing, that actually supports this practice. They have to keep those samples just in case something like this happens.
And like having a backup just in case.
Exactly. And they'll analyze those samples, they'll run all sorts of tests, and they'll also look at the big picture, the whole manufacturing process, from the moment the raw materials arrive to when the finished product is packaged and shipped. Where could something have gone wrong?
So it's really a multi-pronged approach.
It has to be, to get to the root cause of the problem.
Now, I'm assuming that every single step of this investigation, every test, every observation, every decision, it all has to be documented, right? Like no room for scribbling notes on a napkin.
Oh, absolutely not. Everything has to be meticulously documented, following those good documentation practices, or GDOCP.
GDCP.
Now, GDOCP isn't a specific regulation. It's more of a principle that's woven into all the GMP training.
Yeah.
It basically says that every action, from the moment the complaint is received to when it's finally resolved, everything has to be documented clearly, accurately, contemporaneously, which means you write it down as it's happening, and it all has to be traceable.
Traceable, so you can always track back who did what and when.
Exactly. And you have to document everything. What happened, who was involved, when did it happen, where did it happen, and most importantly, why did you make the decisions you made?
So it's not just about what happened, it's about the rationale behind the actions that were taken.
Precisely. And this is where technology really comes in handy. Electronic systems, especially those that are part of a company's quality management system, or QMS, are essential for managing all this documentation.
Right.
They automatically track every change, who made it, when they made it. It's all there in an audit trail.
So it's like a built-in accountability system.
Exactly. And they also make sure that only authorized personnel can access and modify those records,
Right.
which, aligns with those regulations like 21 CFR, Part 11 about electronic records and signatures. It's all about data integrity.
Okay, so we've got a really robust system for collecting complaint data. We've done a thorough investigation. We've pinpointed the root cause. What's next? Does it just end there?
Not at all. Finding the root cause, that's a major step, but it's not the finish line. The next critical phase is implementing what are known as corrective actions and preventive actions, or KPA.
KPA, that's another one of those acronyms you hear all the time in the regulatory world.
Right.
So in the context of, handling complaints, what does KPA actually mean? What does it look like in practice?
Well, if you look at the principles of GMP auditing and quality management systems, KPA is about going beyond just fixing the immediate problem that triggered the complaint.
Okay.
It's about saying, okay, how do we make sure this never happens again? How do we prevent similar issues from cropping up in the future?
So it's like a two-pronged approach. You've got the corrective action, which addresses the immediate problem, and then the preventive action, which is about looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly. It's like you put out the fire, but then you also make sure there's no more fuel lying around to start another one.
I like that analogy.
So to do this effectively, you have to analyze everything. The findings from the investigation, any insights from internal audits, other quality data you might have, and then based on all of that, you develop a plan taking into account the risks involved. And this could lead to all sorts of changes. Maybe you revise your manufacturing procedures. Maybe you update your equipment maintenance schedules. Maybe you give your personnel more training. Or maybe you even change the specifications for your raw materials.
So KPI can have a really broad impact, potentially touching many different aspects of the company's operations.
It can. It's not just about, tweaking one little thing. It's about looking at the whole system and making sure it's robust and resilient.
Now, is this KPI process something that happens in isolation, or is it really integrated into the company's overall quality culture and systems?
It should be fully integrated into the quality management system, or QMS. In fact, KPA is a vital feedback loop within the QMS. What you learn from handling complaints and implementing KPA, it should inform and shape other parts of the QMS. It's
Interesting.
like it could influence the design controls for new products or the way you validate your manufacturing processes. It's all about continuous improvement, always learning and adapting.
That makes sense. Now, I know we touched on this earlier, but I think it's worth clarifying again. What's the difference between a correction and a corrective action?
Sure. A correction is simply fixing the immediate problem. So going back to our example of the injectable medication with particles, a correction might be, okay, let's recall that specific batch of medication, pull it off the market.
Right.
A corrective action, though, digs deeper. Why were those particles there in the first place? Was there a problem with the filtration system?
Oh,
So you might upgrade the filters, you might change your maintenance schedules to prevent that contamination from happening again. The correction addresses the symptom, the corrective action addresses the root cause.
so one is about the here and now, the other is about preventing problems in the future.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, as we talked about earlier, that you don't always need both a correction and a corrective action for every issue. Sometimes a simple correction is enough. It really depends on the nature of the problem and the risks involved.
And I guess the ultimate goal of all this, the complaint handling, the investigations, the CUPE, it's all about making sure that the products that reach patients are safe and effective.
Absolutely. It's about continuous improvement in quality and safety. By being proactive, by thoroughly investigating complaints, and by implementing effective KPA, companies can refine their processes, minimize defects, and ultimately protect the patients who rely on their products.
Now, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what happens when those complaints, or maybe the investigations that follow, reveal a really serious problem, a potential risk to patient safety. That's when we start talking about product recalls.
Right.
And that sounds like a pretty major undertaking.
It is. It's a critical safety mechanism. When there's strong evidence that a product could pose a significant risk to patient health, a recall becomes necessary. And in many cases, it's actually legally required. Now, while we don't have all the details of those specific recall regulations in front of us, it's clear that the FDA has very strict oversight in this area.
Right.
Companies have a huge responsibility to make sure their products are safe. And if they're not, they need to act quickly to get them off the market.
So even though we're not diving into the legal nitty-gritty right now, it's understood that there are very clear expectations from regulators when it comes to removing a potentially dangerous product from circulation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The FDA is keeping a close eye on all of this. They publish a weekly enforcement report that's publicly available, and it lists all the product recalls that have been initiated.
Wow.
And for really serious recalls, those that pose a significant health risk, either the company itself or the FDA will issue a press release to let everyone know, hey, there's a problem with this product, here's what you need to do.
So it's really about getting that information out there quickly and broadly to both healthcare professionals and patients.
Exactly. Timely and accurate communication is essential in these situations.
So what are some of the specific things that pharmaceutical companies need to do to be prepared for a recall? What are their responsibilities?
Well, they need to have a detailed plan in place, a step-by-step procedure that outlines exactly what to do in the event of a recall. And it can't just be a document that sits on a shelf somewhere.
Right.
They need to practice, they need to run drills so everyone knows their role and can act quickly and efficiently. They also need to clearly identify who's in charge, who makes the final decision to initiate the recall, who coordinates everything, who makes sure it's executed properly.
So it's like having a clear chain of command.
Exactly. And they need to have rock-solid systems for tracking their products. Where did each batch go? Who are the distributors? Which pharmacies have it? Which hospitals? They need to be able to trace every single unit, ideally all the way to the patient.
That sounds like a huge logistical challenge, especially for products that are distributed all over the country or even globally.
It is, but it's absolutely essential. The goal is to achieve 100% reconciliation, which means accounting for every single unit that was shipped out. If you can't do that, you can't be sure that you've gotten all of the potentially dangerous product off the market.
That makes sense. And how do companies ensure they have that level of traceability? It seems like a huge task.
It is. And it often involves sophisticated technology, things like serialization, which gives every single unit a unique identifier, and inventory management software that can track products in real time as they move through the supply chain. But technology is only part of the solution.
Okay.
They also need to test their systems. And the best way to do that is through mock recalls. They simulate a recall scenario, go through all the steps, see what works and what doesn't. It's like a fire drill for a product recall.
It's a way to identify any weak points in the system before a real crisis hits.
Exactly. And then they can make adjustments, improve their processes, so they're better prepared when a real recall happens.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there are different classifications of recalls. I think our notes say Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about why those distinctions are important, even if we don't have the specific criteria for each class right in front of us?
Sure. The reason for having these different classes is to categorize recalls based on the level of risk to patients. A class I recall, that's the most serious. It's reserved for products that could cause serious harm or even death.
Wow. Okay.
A Class 2 recall, that's for products that might cause temporary health problems or where the probability of serious harm is lower. And then a Class 3 recall, that's for products that are unlikely to cause any harm, but there's still a problem that needs to be addressed, maybe a labeling issue or something like that.
So the classification system is really a way to communicate the severity of the problem.
Exactly. And it helps to guide the response. A class I recall, that's going to trigger a much more urgent and widespread communication effort. You want to get the word out as quickly as possible to as many people as possible.
Right, because the stakes are much higher.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And that brings us to another really important aspect of any recall, especially those involving serious health risks, and that's communication. You have to communicate clearly and effectively with everyone involved.
So who are we talking about here? Who needs to be informed?
Healthcare professionals, patients, the general public, everyone who might have come into contact with the product. You have to tell them what the problem is, what the potential risks are, and what they need to do. Should they stop using the product? Should they return it? Should they see a doctor?
It's about providing clear, actionable information.
Exactly. And you have to do it in a way that's easy to understand, because in a situation like this, people are going to be anxious. They're going to be looking for guidance.
And just like with complaint handling and KP-PAR, I'm assuming documentation is key here too, right? Every step of the recall process needs to be recorded.
Absolutely. You need to document everything. The decision to initiate the recall, the scope of the recall, which products are affected, which lot numbers, everything. You need to keep records of all your communication efforts, who you contacted, when you contacted them, what you told them, and you need to meticulously track the recalled product, how much was retrieved, where it went, make sure it's all accounted for.
So it's really a cradle-to-grave documentation process.
It is, and it's not just about compliance, although that's certainly important. It's also about having a clear record of what happened so you can learn from it and improve your processes in the future.
And all of this, the complaint handling, the CPA, the recalls, it really boils down to transparency, doesn't it? Being open and honest with everyone involved.
Transparency is absolutely crucial. It's the foundation of trust, not just between companies and regulators, but between companies and the public, between healthcare providers and their patients. When companies are transparent about problems, when they're upfront about what they're doing to fix them, it builds confidence. It shows that they're taking safety seriously.
And it's not just about ethics, right? It's also about meeting regulatory expectations.
Absolutely. Regulators like the FDA, they expect companies to be transparent. And if they're not, there can be serious consequences.
So transparency is good for everyone. It protects patients, it helps companies stay in compliance, and it builds trust in the system as a whole.
Exactly. And ultimately, all of these processes that we've been talking about, they all serve a common purpose. They're all part of a larger effort to make sure that the medications and medical devices that people rely on are safe and effective.
And that effort is really grounded in those good manufacturing practices, the GMPs, and the whole regulatory framework that's built around them.
It is. Those regulations may seem complicated, but they're there for a reason. They provide the structure and the accountability that's needed to protect public health. And when you understand those regulations, when you see how they play out in real-world situations like complaint handling and product recalls, it gives you a whole new appreciation for the importance of quality and safety in the pharmaceutical industry.
I completely agree. And I think it also underscores the fact that these processes are not just about paperwork and bureaucracy. They're about people. They're about making sure that the products that reach patients are safe, and that if something does go wrong, there are systems in place to identify it, correct it, and prevent it from happening again.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and I hope this deep dive has been informative for our listeners. I know I've learned a lot.
Me too.
And I think the takeaway here is that as patients, as consumers, we have a right to expect that the products we use are safe and effective. And as members of the healthcare community, we have a responsibility to be aware of these processes, to understand how they work, and to advocate for continuous improvement in quality and safety.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I would encourage our listeners to continue learning about these issues, to explore the resources that are available, and to engage in conversations about how we can work together to make the healthcare system even safer and more reliable.
That's a great point. This is an ongoing conversation, and everyone has a role to play. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we look forward to exploring more important topics with you in the future.